All right, well, welcome to the Tuesday morning Bible study for June the 15th, middle of June in 2021. Today, we are continuing our study of Genesis by picking up where we left off in chapter 17. We're going to finish chapter 17, and my belief, whether well or ill-founded, it will remains to be seen, but my belief is that we will get through about the middle of chapter 18 today. And then next week, my hope is that we will get into at least the preliminaries of the Sodom and Gomorrah story, which is always riveting reading. So very exciting stuff. All right, so let's open up to Genesis chapter 17. As I say, we'll pick up where we left off last week. All right. Yeah. All right. Chapter 17. And where we left off last week was roughly verse 8, where we were talking about Abram's name change to Abraham. And I was just pointing out that the name change is more it's the name change is meant to communicate something different that has happened, and that or to not so much different that's happening, that to emphasize something different. Whereas Abram's name literally means ancestor or father of, in the sense of being an ancestor of. It is shifting here to Abraham to bring out the idea that he's not just an ancestor, but that he's the ancestor of a multitude. He's not just the ancestor of a few people, he's the ancestor of many nations. And that's what the name is actually meant to go after. Now, technically, as we pointed out last week, technically, linguistically, there is no real difference between the names Abram and Abraham. However, Abraham has a close resemblance to a compound Hebrew word, Ab-Hamon, which would, if used, would literally mean father of a multitude, ancestor of a multitude. And that's what and so in essence, this is a kind of pun in a way. It's kind of a Hebrew pun, which of course you would never get in English translation. But in Hebrew, a person, not me, but a person who knows Hebrew very well would recognize the pun going on. All right. So that is, so we see that with this name change, there is a kind of, there's a name change based on covenantal identity. Now, beginning at verse 19 now, or I'm sorry, verse 9. So verse 9, we'll read from there. God said to Abraham, "As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you through their generations. This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you." That is, this is the sign of the covenant. This is like your membership card, okay? This is what shows everyone, or is assigned to you and assigned to anyone else, that you are a member of this club, you are a member of this covenant. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. Throughout your generations, every male among you shall be circumcised when he is 8 days old. Now, I'm going to say something about that in just a moment. Why 8? Why 8 days old? Why not before or after? Including the slave born in your house and the one bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring. both the slave born in your house and the one bought with your money must be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. All right, we'll pause there. Okay. A couple of things going on here that are worth exploring. Any things in the passage as read that you that strike you?
Apparently, you don't necessarily have to be Jewish if they circumcise their slaves, right?
Right.
So,
right. It's not, that was one of those things, is that it's, this is a good, that's actually a great point, that it finally, in the end, wasn't finally about ethnic identity. It was about that while it had a strong correlation to ethnic identity, it wasn't based on that entirely, that it was about participating in a covenant, and that theoretically anyone could participate in it. Anyone of any race or any ethnicity could participate in it and be a member of Israel in this sense. But this was the sign in the flesh that you were participating in this agreement between God and Abraham.
So the covenant is extended beyond the Jewish people. Anybody who's circumcised.
Nobody's gonna. There are not going to be many people who are going to volunteer for that. Okay, I mean, just recognizing that not everybody's going to volunteer for that. But in principle, yes. Now, in this case, it was the non-Jews who were in Abraham's household did not have a choice. They did not have a choice in this matter, because they belonged to Abraham's household. They were included. But it is interesting, though, and the point you're making, the point that you're raising here is an interesting one, because it is clear that people not springing from Abraham's loins are nevertheless being circumcised because they're part of his household. It's also noteworthy that, as we will see here in just a moment, but it's understood from the command that's already been given, that it is not just those in the line of promise who are being circumcised here. I mean, as we're going to see in just a few minutes, that Isaac is the line of promise, Ishmael is not, and yet Ishmael is also getting circumcised. Okay, and so it really has to do with being a descendant of Abraham more than it has to do with necessarily being part of the promised, part of the line of promise. So, but it's interesting because ultimately the circumcision is a sign of the promise. So it kind of is ambiguous. I mean, maybe that's the thing to say finally, is that it is ambiguous here.
Given other writings of the ancient Hebrews, I don't find it surprising that they would extend circumcision into his household, but I find it very surprising that those ancient writers would say that the covenant is extended to these people. Very surprising.
Yeah. And it's not something that's universal or that happened all the time, but you do have, at least here, you do have, it is clear that the people who were not of the specific line of, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, that they were nevertheless circumcised, that Ishmael was circumcised, presumably Ishmael's descendants, would continue the practice. I don't know, I hate to say this, but I don't actually know if circumcision is something that's practiced in the Islamic community. I'm embarrassed to say I don't know that, but I don't know if that's a practice that's carried on in the Islamic community. Although if it were, it would make sense. It would make sense that it were, but
But circumcision has long since lost its, well, maybe it hasn't lost it for Jewish people, but for most of us, it's lost its religious circumstance, connection, and
Right.
was done, I think, for health reasons, they thought, So
Right.
I'm wondering if you were Islamic, whether it would have been done for health reasons,
possibly.
or whether your religion would say, and if it wasn't, then your religion might say, no, we don't believe in circumcision, don't do it, and then that would be honored too, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So I don't know at what point it totally lost the religious
Mhm.
meaning and became just a health thing.
Yeah. Now, it's also true too that cultural anthropologists have, and this goes back to my college studies in anthropology, but cultural anthropologists, have shown that what often is presented in our sacred texts as a sacred practice, often were invented. I mean, like when if you could go back to when they first started to practice certain things, that the practices had a practical basis, and that anthropologists have speculated as to the origin of kosher laws, that this was that perhaps in the beginning that the origin of kosher laws did have something to do with health and with just the realities of living in that part of the world in that time, and what foods could be preserved well, and so forth and so on, and that by following this particular regimen, that people would tend to be healthier. It's kind of a chicken and egg question, it's like what came first, the divine command that then led to the practice, or did the practice actually arise kind of on its own and then get endorsed by, kind of get adopted by religion, because it was known to be healthy. It was seen to be promoting of good hygiene and good health, and that's
Interesting, the
chicken egg question.
to find out what the roots of circumcision really were. I mean, did they do it way back then for health reasons? Did they realize that, and now they're thinking maybe.
And they may have. That's the thing. They may have recognized that.
Somebody's probably studied that somewhere.
Yeah. And they may, in ancient times when this was done, like 2,000 years before Christ, it may very well be that they did recognize that there were certain benefits, health benefits and other kinds of benefits that may come from it. Now, what's interesting here from our textual point of view is, you might ask yourself, well, why this sign of all the things that God might choose, of all the things that God might choose to do, or to ask you to do, to show your participation in the covenant, you might ask, why this? Why of all the possible things could be done? And I think that the simplest answer in this case is probably the correct one. The simplest answer is that this whole passage, this entire part of Genesis, is about how Abraham is going to be a father, an ancestor. He is going to be the beginning of a great multitude of descendants. It's when you consider that that's the main focus here, for the sign, the physical sign, to have something to do with well, there's no delicate way of putting this, but Abraham's John Thomas, you know, that you, that it's not all that surprising that that the sign in the flesh would have something to do with that, you know. That has been suggested by any number of biblical scholars and presented as the simplest explanation. And as we know, you know, in Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is usually the correct one.
But this would only affect males. Obviously, the female was not that important, you know.
Well,
Otherwise, maybe we'd all have you know, whatever the Indians put up here on their foreheads. Maybe we would all have that instead. But this is a very male thing. So.
Right. Yeah. Well, you know, and you know, as you certainly know, there are other forms of circumcision that exist out in the world, not in the Jewish community. Other forms of circumcision that do exist out in the world that do involve women, but they are not. Well, number one, they're not voluntary, but they're also not
Health related.
They're not health related either. Yeah, in fact, if anything, they're
They're an oppressive thing.
Right. They're an oppressive thing. They're about social control,
Yeah.
About ensuring that women
Don't
they
have
can still have children, but they don't enjoy it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So,
But aren't you a Jew if your mother's a Jew?
that
I'm sorry,
is
what, Sandy?
yeah, that's a different.
Classified as a Jew if your mother's a Jew.
That is something that arose in rabbinic Judaism. I'm not I wouldn't claim the title of scholar of this kind of question, but my understanding is that the matriarchal descent, the thing that made you a Jew, that was, I'm not sure of the exact history of that, but I believe that arose in rabbinic Judaism.
Okay.
Because in biblical Judaism,
Mm-hmm.
it ain't about your mom, it's about your dad. You know, it's about who your dad is.
Yeah.
It's in rabbinic Judaism that we do see this. We see this, that it is by your mother that you're Jewish or not. But that's not really in fact, that is unequivocally not the case in biblical times Judaism.
Okay.
Because if that were the rule, then there would be any number of people. There'd be any number of people who are regarded as biblical heroes who would not qualify as Jewish under a matriarchal system. Yeah. Not to mention, I mean, the simplest or the most obvious one would be the line of King David, because of you know, David is descended from Boaz and Ruth was not Jewish. And so, yeah, so this is something that only happens later. All right. So yeah, that's the simplest explanation for why circumcision of all things is that it is connected to the idea of having multitudes of descendants. Now, the other little detail that's interesting is the timing of the circumcision. It says in verse 12, every male among you shall be circumcised when he is 8 days old. Different theories as to why 8 days. Probably the best explanation is offered by another text in the Torah. If you'll hold your place in Genesis and you turn to Leviticus, chapter 12. Okay. Turn to Leviticus chapter 12. This is an interesting thing. This is kind of, I think, kind of the definitive answer to why 8 days. Leviticus chapter 12. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, saying, If a woman conceives and bears a male child, she shall be ceremonially unclean for 7 days. Ceremonially unclean for 7 days. As at the time of her menstruation, she shall be unclean. On the 8th day, the flesh of the child's foreskin shall be circumcised. And it goes on, there's a whole bunch of language about purification and whatnot. But the point is the answer to the question of why on the 8th day, because it seems that since the mother would be ceremonially unclean for 7 days, to circumcise the child on the 8th day means that the mother can be there. The mother, it would be allowed to be there, because if the circumcision were, say, on the 3rd day, the mother couldn't be there. She couldn't participate. She'd be ceremonially unclean and would have to stay in isolation, But on the 8th day, she is no longer unclean from the childbirth, and therefore she could be present when the male child is circumcised. So if you are ever wondering, about why on the 8th day, that is the really the definitive reason.
And if you keep reading there, which I'm always curious about, another thing about women, if she has a female child, she's unclean for 14 days. Oh, really?
Yeah, I was going to say, if you're looking for proto-feminism here, you're not going to
You won't find it here.
You're just not. Total fairness to it, you're not going to find it. You get a lot closer in the New Testament. I'm happy to say you get a lot closer in the New Testament, but yeah, you don't get a lot of that here. Okay, all right. So there is that. Okay, so let's go now to verse 15. One of the things I like about Genesis, and we haven't seen too many examples of this yet, but we're going to. I can promise you we're going to. And it's kind of in the spirit of what Lois was just saying. One thing I love about Genesis as a whole is that there really is a place, an important place for women as characters in the narrative. Again, we haven't seen too much of that yet, but we're going to, where the woman, the wife, is going to be the center of attention for an episode. So let's look at verse 15. And then Sarah takes on an even more interesting role in the beginning of chapter 18. But yeah, let's stay in 17 and look at verse 15. God said to Abraham, As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name, Sarah. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall give rise to nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said to himself, Can a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Can Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, Oh, that Ishmael might live in your sight. That is, oh, may Ishmael prosper and continue in your sight. God said, No, but your wife Sarah shall bear you a son, and you shall name him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will bless him and make him fruitful and exceedingly numerous. He shall be the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this season next year. finally we get a time, it's like, it's always, it'll happen, keep having faith. But I mean, God actually puts a timetable in place now. And when he had finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. And then we'll just go ahead and we'll finish the chapter. Then Abraham took his son Ishmael and all the slaves born in his house or bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very day, as God had said to him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And his son Ishmael was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. That very day, Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised, and all the men of his house, slaves born in the house, and those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. All right. So things are happening. Okay. God's put a timetable in place. She's going to have the baby. She's going to have this child of promise next season. And, it's time to get serious about this sign, maybe you're not looking forward to it, but it's time to put, to seal the deal, as it were. And do this circumcision of every male in the house. It's going to get easier. I mean, it's kind of like anything. The first part of it's the worst, and then, from then on out, any male is never going to remember their own circumcision. From then on out, it's going to be when you're 8 days old, and it'll hurt at the time, but you won't remember it. And so this is the first and only generation of males, for the most part, who experience it like that. Now the thing that's just unavoidable and it's absolutely delicious is Abraham's reaction to God telling him this and giving him the timetable and everything. He's given him the sign. This is what you're going to do, what you need to do. And then tells him for sure it's going to happen. It's going to happen. And Abraham's reaction, and granted, Abraham has had 24? Yeah, he's had 24 years. 24 years to think about this. To when he, from the time he first got the message from God that he was going to be the father of nations and all this, 24 years since then. And finally it's coming together. And in this moment of, after 24 years of getting these promises and not seeing any results, Abraham, how does it put it in verse 17? Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed. Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, can a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? It was, it was fairly implausible when he was 75, but now he's 100 years old. He's almost 100 years old. Can a child be born to a man who's 100 years old? Can Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And he says, well, may Ishmael, what about Ishmael? Ishmael's a good kid. He's 13 now, he's growing up. He seems to be turning out okay, not too much trouble. And, let him be the one. Let him be the one that carries the family name on and all that. And God, of course, makes clear that, hey, I hear you. I understand. And I'm going to bless Ishmael. Ishmael is, whatever the exact circumstances of how that came about, I'm going to bless Ishmael. He's going to be the father of 12 princes. He's going to be the ancestor of many, many peoples. There is absolutely no indication whatsoever of God's disapproval of Ishmael or of Ishmael's descendants. But the promise that I've made to you is not, Ishmael is not the fulfillment of those promises I've made to you. He's a great kid. He's going to be a great, great ancestor of many nations, but he's not the one that's going to prove to you, or be is going to prove to you that I'm acting. In essence, Ishmael, you kind of made Ishmael happen. And again, I love Ishmael. I'm God. I love Ishmael. Ishmael's great. He's going to be ancestor of many descendants. But the one who's going to show you that I'm serious is the baby you're going to have this time next year through your wife, Sarah, who is 99 years old. And you're 100, she's 90, or you're 99, she's 89, she's gonna be 90. And he falls on his face and laughs. I want to share with you just a wonderful little passage from a wonderful book I've had for many, many years. Probably got it when, let's see, there we go. I probably got it when I was in seminary at one of those wonderful seminary book sales. At Princeton anyway. I know they do them at Columbia too, but at Princeton they always did them in like April. And it was just a big giant book sale, used book sale. And you went in with paper bags and you filled the bags up with books, and they'd sell them to you for, you know, 20 bucks for a full bag of books. You know, it was every seminarian's dream. And of course, every spouse's nightmare. Every spouse's nightmare that her or his spouse would be coming home with bags of books. Well, anyway, this book right here, one I probably had since then. It's by Frederick Buechner, the familiar Presbyterian, beloved Presbyterian writer and public theologian. A wonderful book called Wishful Thinking, a Theological ABC. And it is that. It's almost like a dictionary, except it has little articles on any number of different themes. And he's got entries for any number of things. And he's got an entry for faith. Okay, now we've already seen how Abraham is presented as a model of faith, right? This is the article for faith. I'm not going to read the whole article because not all of it is about Abraham, but the first part of it is. And I want to read it because it bears directly on what we've just been reading. When God told Abraham, who was 100 at the time, that at the age of 90, his wife Sarah was finally going to have a baby, Abraham came close to knocking himself out, fell on his face and laughed, as Genesis puts it. In another version of the story, chapter 18, verse 8 and following, which we'll be reading in just a moment, Sarah is hiding behind the door, eavesdropping. And here it's Sarah herself who nearly splits a gut, although when God asks her about it afterward, she denies it. No, but you did laugh, God says, thus having the last word as well as the first. God doesn't seem to hold their outburst against them, however. On the contrary, he tells them that the baby's going to be a boy and that he wants them to name him Isaac. Isaac in Hebrew means laughter. Why did the two old crocs laugh? They laughed because they knew only a fool would believe that a woman with one foot in the grave was soon going to have her other foot in the maternity ward. They laughed because God expected them to believe it anyway. They laughed because God seemed to believe it. They laughed because they half believed it themselves. They laughed because laughing felt better than crying. They laughed because if by some crazy chance it just happened to come true, they would really have something to laugh about. And in the meanwhile, it helped keep them going. The article continues, but it's a wonderful little reflection on the laughter that came about, and that would ultimately be, of course, be the foundation for the name of the son. All right. Let's see. did somebody somebody just disappeared, didn't they? Or maybe I'm mistaken. I thought I saw something happen on the screen for a moment, and I was wondering if somebody went away, but okay. All right. So here we are. We've got Abraham nearly falling on his face and laughing. This was the priestly account. This was the P account. In chapter 18, we have the J writer again. And you're going to know that it's the J writer after me reading just a few verses in chapter 18, because it's going to have the signs of the J writer. How anyone could not read all this and think that it was all the work of one hand is just, I just don't know how that's possible, because these different perspectives really do have different perspectives, and they tell the stories in different ways. All right, so chapter 18. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, and knead it, and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "There in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be, I love this phraseology. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time, I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied it, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. And he said, "Oh, yes, you did laugh." Oh, yes, you did laugh. All right, we'll pause there. Okay. There's some good things here. There's also some really weird things going on here. Some mysterious stuff going on here. I think you see how you know it's the J writer, because the J writer, as opposed to the P writer, the J writer is the one who's going to present God in very anthropomorphic ways. Mm-hmm. P writer would never do that. Would never ever do that. J writer, though, has God, walking in the garden, and God appearing in kind of a human form, looking human, standing before Abraham. So what are some of the thoughts you have on this? Some of the questions that you might have.
Well, if that was the Lord, why in 3 different figures? I think that's confusing.
Right. Now this is one of those times where we have to resist the temptation to read into it something that there is no possible way. No possible.
The Trinity?
way.
Are you talking about the Trinity?
Exactly. That there is no possible way that the original writer could have had that intention. Okay, there's simply no possible way that could have happened. But yes, in Christian interpretation, Christians have sometimes read this passage as a kind of foreshadowing of the Trinity, as a sign of the Trinity. You know, this was the to paraphrase the Don McLean song, American Pie, the three men that I admire most, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. Yeah. Three men that I admire most. Yeah. So there you are. Yeah, that's great. And you wonder why three? And Abraham's reaction is interesting because it's like he clearly recognizes that this is somehow a divine visitation. Not in the hospitality he shows, because he would have done that to anybody. He would have, I mean, any three visitors, just normal, you, me, and a friend, if we showed up at Abraham's tent, he'd be getting food together. He'd be asking Sarah to bake some cakes, and he'd get a calf, and he'd be putting food in front of us. That was just good manners. If you lived out in this part of the world and you had visitors, it was considered terribly bad manners not to show them hospitality. And so he'd be doing that anyway. But he clearly recognizes that these are not ordinary visitors, because of the language that he uses, and the fact of what the visitors say to him in the latter part of the passage that we read, because they clearly are, one of them actually, it says, they said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "There in the tent." Then one of the three said, "I will return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." So this is, you'd think of this as either God or as a mouthpiece for God saying, this is going to happen. So Abraham recognizes this is a divine visitation. Why three? Hard to say. Here's the thing, though, and this is something, this actually has an answer as to who, not so much why three, but identifying who the three are, as opposed to identifying them as the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Okay. That if we put together this scene together with what's coming in chapter 19, we're going to see that of these three, one of them is supposed to be God. Two of them are supposed to be angels. Okay. We know this. This isn't just Tom making this up. You don't know what I do make up. Sometimes I do make things up, but I'm not making this up. If you look at chapter 19, look at chapter 19, the first verse of chapter 19. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. Okay. The two angels. This makes sense. This reference to the two angels makes sense when you then bring it back together with what's being said here in the chapter before about the three visitors. One of them is God. One of them is supposed to be understood as God, and the two are the two angels of chapter 19.
Tom, before I forget it, I have a couple of three comments. Well, Sharon pointed out that the J writer is a different writer, obviously had access to the P writer's writings because the name is already changed in Abraham, right? He doesn't mention changing the name in his writings.
Oh, right. No, this is an example of the redactor. Remember now that you've got the redactor who comes along and is bringing these sources together, and then it's like the redactor takes an eraser and goes, and is making changes. I know it's a great observation. It's a fantastic observation. But that's part of the work of the redactors. The redactor would come in and in the process of bringing these sources together and trying to create a single narrative out of what originally were two separate narratives, the redactor would, per his title, redact.
Have access already. Yeah, and
Yeah, he would redact, and so he would make those kinds of changes. The thing that that really tips us off that it's this, at least in its original form, was the J writer. What tips us off really is the anthropomorphic nature of the appearance. The fact that we see three men in front of Abraham, that is something that the P writer would not have done. For
I like the style of the J writer. It's much more literary. It's like reading. I would say the P writer is Ernest Hemingway, and the J writer is Thomas Wolfe.
Sure. Yeah. That's great. No, that's very good. That's very good.
Yeah. I like Thomas Wolfe.
It's in the J writer certainly that we get the earthiness. We get some of the depictions of God, which are are probably the biggest departures from what, especially we in the, well, I started to say we in the Reformed tradition. Not all of us here are of the Reformed tradition, but in the Reformed tradition, there is a very transcendent view of God, a God who is, there's a special emphasis on the transcendence of God, the infinity of God, as opposed to the closeness and the intimacy of God. Other traditions emphasize that more than the Reformed tradition usually does. And in that sense, the J writer is a bigger departure from that. The God in J writer is more fleshy and more, he's going to eat he's going to eat a meal in front of you, that kind of thing. He would never have that in the P writer. So yeah, no, that's good. That's good. Okay, so there was something else I wanted to be sure to point out. No, okay. So you have the three. One is, I mean, we'll see that one is God and that there are two angels there. Now, having said that, so often in these scriptures, there is little practical difference between God and an angel of God. Because we'll see it elsewhere in Genesis. We'll also see it in, we would see it in other books of the Old Testament too, where there is great ambiguity between, if somebody encounters one of these manifestations, they will sometimes go back and forth as to whether they're saying, I encountered God or I encountered an angel. That there's some flexibility in how you say that, because to meet God or to meet an angel of God, especially the so-called angel of the presence or the angel of the Lord, is effectively to meet God, because it's like the angel of the Lord is the face that God makes visible to human beings in these stories. And so it's kind of a double sense. It's both God and a sort of a secondary manifestation of God. They end up being, this is a long and complicated story, but the Christian idea of Jesus being the Son of God, being a human being, and yet in some way, some fashion, it being proper to speak of him as the presence of God, the manifestation of God, actually stems from this feature of Old Testament Judaism. It's that you have this ambiguity within Old Testament Judaism. And there was a piece of that kind of speculation about who or what exactly is the angel of the Lord that would over time evolve into the apocalyptic teaching of God and the so-called Son of Man of Daniel chapter 7. And it is from speculating and sort of trying to exegete these passages that we have the idea that there could be a Jesus, that there could be a figure who would appear, who would be both in a manner of speaking separate from God and yet also a manifestation of God, as difficult as that is to get your mind around. But all that was happening at just in New Testament times, all that was happening at just the time when the Pharisaical movement was rejecting all of that speculation in favor of emphasizing strongly the oneness of God, the uniqueness and oneness and transcendence of God. And so you can see that in essence, the conflict between rabbinic Judaism represented by the Pharisees and the Christian movement that was talking about Jesus in this way that clearly has roots in the Jewish tradition, you can see that this was one of the ways in which they parted ways. And both of them were claiming aspects of the ancient Jewish tradition, but aspects that, if taken to their logical conclusions, but would butt heads against each other. And so this is one of the way. This is a whole class. This is a whole nother class. This is a series, a Sunday school series. And this is one of the factors that led to the division between Judaism and Christianity over this kind of thing. But that's a whole nother subject, and it needs time to be developed in a proper way. I've just maybe whetted your appetite for it. All right, we are getting close to the end, but let's go now. Let's look more closely at verses 9 through 15 and the scene with Sarah. Where it doesn't specify whether it's God or whether it's one of the angels, but it says one of them said, I will, or perhaps presumably it's God, I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance. She was eavesdropping. And Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. And so Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure? The Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time, I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. And he said, oh, yes, you did laugh. I love that. Just love that. And as Frederick Buechner points out, that oh yes you did laugh is not said in a oh yes you did laugh and now I'm going to have to destroy you. It's not said in that way. It's said in a more comic way. And to go back to the old J and P thing, you would not expect comedy out of the P writer. You definitely can get some comedy in the J writer. But yeah, so it's said in that way, kind of like, oh yeah, you did. Oh, you did laugh. And you're going to see what's going to happen. Just hang on and keep watching. That's the spirit in which in which God responds. I just love that. I absolutely love that. I love the fact that Isaac's name means laughter. That the second of the patriarchs, the second generation patriarch, receives his name. His name is a sign of the fact that his parents laughed when God reiterated the promise, that they laughed, and that fact is memorialized for all generations in their son's name, meaning laughter or he laughed. I just love that. I love it. My 11:30 bell, the bell here at Friendship is chiming to show that it's 11:30. So that's a good sign that it's probably time to start wrapping up anything. What other thoughts or reflections do you have on what we've covered today? I know I remember growing up in the Buchanan household. I remember going into the shower in the middle of the house, going into the shower and seeing something that my mom had painted. Yeah, oh yeah, it wasn't a picture, it was words. And you had painted like some Bible verses. And one of the verses was, "Is anything too hard for the Lord, or anything too wonderful for the Lord?" That was one of the things that was painted there. I don't know why I remember that, but it came up the other day as I was reading this passage in preparation for our session today. I remembered that, and I know it was there. But it was like, it's like you should go into the shower, it's like right in front of you. It was these Bible verses, and that was one of them. Is anything too hard for the Lord, or something like that. So anyway, I don't mean to embarrass you I don't want you to be embarrassed by that, but I think that's a great verse. I think that's a great verse. If you're gonna go to the trouble of painting a verse and put it in your shower, that's probably a good verse. Good verse to have there, you know.
Well, what amazing to me is you hear about people finding out a woman in her 40s, say mid 40s, that she's expecting a baby. And usually a lot of the times it's not met with laughter. So
Right.
it absolutely amazes me that Sarah could just laugh. I'm amazed that she didn't become hysterical.
It's actually something that Donna Rigsby, our office administrator, and I were talking about, that kind of that very thing, that you know, that you could easily imagine someone being of older, not necessarily 99, 100 years old or whatever, but being 40 or older and getting the news you're going to have a baby and going, no, like, and I just casually said, I'm 52 and I'm really glad not to have a little bundle of joy at home, so it's kind of, I kind of like being 52 and cruising towards 65, and I kind of like the idea of things getting a little quieter as time rolls on. Things get a little quieter, but yeah, and of course in this case, the one thing that I guess you could sort of say to balance that very understandable, like, oh, what in the world are we doing? Why? How is this? Is to balance it with the fact that in that day and time, for a woman to be barren would be, I mean, that would be like a living death. That would be, culturally speaking, that would be regarded as the worst possible misfortune. I mean, it would be better for you to be killed by an invading army than it would be for you to not bear children, and you know, and honestly, again, this is the world in which this happened, to not have sons, you know, to not bear sons. That would be the worst possible misfortune. And so in this case, it's good news, you know. I mean, yeah, she's had to wait a long time. I mean, had to wait 90 years. Normally it doesn't, you don't have to wait that long. But so it would be received as good news. But then the good news is balanced in this case by the fact that it's so completely ridiculous. It's so completely like this doesn't happen and will never happen again. You know, it's completely impossible. It's completely absurd. And that's the great part, is that literally everyone in the story, including God, knows that it's ridiculous. You know, it's not like, oh, yes, Lord, yes, I will be the father of many nations. Oh, yes, Lord, my wife, who is very old, is going to have a baby. Oh, thank you. Thank you for being so good to me. No, everyone in the story knows it's ridiculous. And they respond accordingly. They respond the way any of us would respond. Like that is just the biggest cockamamie pile of nonsense that I've ever heard, that I'm going to have a baby when I'm 90 years old, you know? And so this is a good example of just how warmly human these stories are. And they are really, they're especially, as I say, in the J Writer, especially, they're very warmly human. They're very recognizable, even though there's some things that happen in them that are amazing and remarkable, and you can't imagine them happening ever again. At the same time, it's kind of like you watch a movie, a fantasy where, you know, all kinds of, you know, fantastical things happen, and they happen to people who are not expecting them. You know, people in the movie, the characters are people like us, and yet they walk through a wardrobe and find themselves in Narnia, you know. You know, that kind of thing. And so we read these stories and we see just how richly and warmly human they are.
And I think we need to think about Abraham and hand it to him, because like you say, being barren was unacceptable, totally. Abraham never leaves Sarah. In fact, he drives Hagar away because Sarah asks him to. So
Yeah.
here is a man who's and a wife who have been together for a long time, you know, and he could have ditched her and gotten another wife and, you know, done all that. And then Becky, I wanted to say, you have to remember that Sarah had all these servants. So it wasn't like she was going to have to take care of this baby all by herself. At least there was that.
Right. This is almost like a royal family kind of
Right.
situation. You know, you need plenty of nannies and whatnot. Yeah, no, exactly. I was watching Downton Abbey. Lisa and I were watching Downton Abbey reruns just the other day, and there were references, you know, to the fact that, yeah, you know, I see my children at 3 o'clock every day, you know, for an hour, you know.
Yeah, I know.
You know, so there's that. So, all right. Well, I know we've got to wrap up. This has been fun today, and I hope that. Let me just say, in the way of housekeeping, if any of you are interested in following our worship services, if you've ever been wondering about them, this Sunday we start at Friendship. We start the Summer Saints sermon series. Say that really fast, several times. Summer Saints sermon series. And this is where we take a figure each Sunday for 8 Sundays, take a figure usually of the past. In this case, all of our Summer Saints are passed on, 19th or 20th century figures for the most part. And we are going to look at their lives and see what they have to teach us about living faithfully today. This group is a pretty diverse group. We've got 4 men, 4 women, 3 out of 8 are African American. So it's a good diverse mix, gender, race, culture, that kind of thing. This coming Sunday, we start the series and we will be looking at Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher and theologian, one of my theological heroes. And I'm going to give a message that focuses on an aspect of Kierkegaard and what he has to teach us about discipleship, about following Christ. And we're also going to use in worship, like in our prayer of confession, prayer of thanksgiving, we're going to use prayers that he composed as pieces of our worship. So if you have a mind to come to Athens, or if you live in Athens, you can come to Friendship and join us at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. We also, of course, have online worship, and so the worship service will be pre-recorded. I'll probably be recording it on about Thursday, but we'll have a pre-recorded worship service available on the church's Facebook page. And on the YouTube page. If you can get to the YouTube page via our website, go to friendship.org, you can access it that way. So it should be fun. And so we've got several. We've got Sojourner Truth, the Reverend John Witherspoon, the only clergyman to sign the Declaration of Independence. That's naturally on July 4th. Have the Reverend William Henry Shepherd, who is the African-American, he was African-American, he was a Presbyterian minister, and he was a missionary to Africa. And he had the wherewithal to get a presbytery named for him. in the presbytery that my parents' church, First Presbyterian of Auburn, is in, the Shepherds and Lapsley Presbytery. There are 2 other interesting figures that just jump out real quick, and I'll tell you about. The final one in the series will be Katherine Johnson, an African-American woman who, if you've ever seen the movie Hidden Figures, about the women who were the mathematicians who provided the calculations that got us to the moon, that got NASA to the moon. Katherine Johnson was one of those mathematicians, and just happened to be a Presbyterian elder, but had nothing to do with my choice of her. She was a Presbyterian elder. Probably the most provocative choice towards the end of the series, not at the end, but close to it, is Charles Darwin. And I'm going to be talking about the gift to theology, and I would say to faith, that Charles Darwin's work represented. It's one of those gifts that a lot of people don't recognize, and don't recognize why it's a gift or how it could be a gift. But I would say that it actually is, and offers us quite a bit. So, and if you're into poetry, Emily Dickinson, the poet, is one of our summer saints also.
So you have chosen are these Tom Buchanan's saints? Is that
I got some input. I asked for some input.
But they're not Catholic saints, when I think of saints, I think of the traditional canonized saints.
Yeah, not that they wouldn't be. I have had Catholic canonized saints in the past. None of them happen to be that this year. They're, for the most part, they're people who've either were just, prominent Christian figures, often involved in social justice. Sojourner Truth, of course. William Henry Shepherd, as it happened, was very much involved in the struggle for racial justice and everything in his own day, in his criticism of the Belgian authorities in the Congo. So Emily Dickinson, not really an Orthodox Christian in the ordinary sense of the word. I say that she is very significant for many reasons, but one of the ways in which she's very significant for our purposes is that she she does write about mortality a lot. So much of her poetry is about mortality, and I would say that a big part of what it is to live faithfully in the world, both as a Christian and as a human being, is to face the prospect of our mortality and to make our peace with that. That's part of what it is to live successfully in the world, is to learn how to face our mortality and draw strength from it rather than allow it to, drag us down.
That sounds interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, if you're interested, just go to the website, go to friendship.org, and under events, it'll give you the schedule. And then on the main page, there's a link to the YouTube page, which you can use to access the services. So,
My question was the same as Lois's. The Presbyterian Church doesn't actually canonize people,
No.
right? No.
No.
Okay.
I mean, there are lots of people who might as well be canonized.
Yeah.
People who sort of have entered into the pantheon of the honored dead, you could say. But
Well, there's
but
the
no.
hymn that we sing. I sing a song of the saints of God, faithful and brave and true. So you're talking about faithful, brave, and true people. In other words,
that's going to be a hymn that we're going to sing periodically.
Yeah.
In the online services, I'll say, one of the hymns that we'll sing that way. So, okay.
Wonderful hymn.
Yeah. Oh, it is. I was introduced to it by my my mentor and former boss, Jill Oglesby Evans at Emory Presbyterian, because I got the idea of Summer Saints from her. As far as I know, she invented the Summer Saints concept, and I'm sure other people have done it in different ways, but I got it from her. And she would always choose that hymn as the hymn that got the series started. And so, and did it at the end too, as I recall.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, I know we need to go. So I hope all of you have a blessed day. Let's pray before we go. Lord, we give you thanks for this day and for this opportunity to gather here in this way. Thank you that that you confront us in many different ways in our own lives, sometimes in the obvious events of our lives, other times you confront us silently and quietly. But there are so many opportunities where we are faced with a choice of trust or not trusting. And sometimes the call to trust might even drive us to a kind of laughter, as it did for Abraham and Sarah. We pray that yes, we may laugh, but hopefully we also find our way to embrace the promise, to embrace your presence, and to trust you as we follow you. We pray these things now in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. All right, everyone.
Okay.
Well, y'all have a
Thank
great
you.
rest of the day.
Thanks for another great
Thanks,
lesson,
Tom.
Tom.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.